Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining today. My name is Carey Beranek. I've been supporting autistic and neurodiverse individuals since the mid-90s, just right here in Arizona, and I've spent the last 26 years or so continuing to do so. As Aaron said, I'm currently the Vice President of Children and Youth Services here at AZA United, and that includes our speech therapy program, occupational therapy program, and ABA treatment services. One of the most striking things about this work is the realization that the more you learn, the less you know. But this is something I actually love about this work. It allows us to engage in a cycle of listening and learning and hopefully doing better. And I find that to be very optimistic. Thanks to autistic self-advocates and contemporary research, the way that autism service providers support autistic people has evolved. So today I'm going to be sharing my observations and interpretations about this evolution. So my talk will cover topics related to neurodiversity and ableism and how quality of life is eclipsing outdated approaches to service delivery. Oh, this isn't very good. Okay, the most obvious way that some of these changes are showing up is through the language that we use. In 2020, the Organization for Autism Research conducted a survey of over 1,000 people to get a better understanding of which labels do the majority of audiences prefer. So the question was very simple. Do you prefer person first language or identity first language? So do you prefer person with autism or autistic person? And out of the respondents, as I said, just a little over 1,000, uh, most of these individuals were self-advocates, meaning a person on the autism spectrum. And we had some parents, some siblings, and some related professionals as well. And those results showed that 81% of the people who responded preferred that identity first language, meaning they preferred autistic instead of person with autism. 76% said that they were more likely to use source services or resources that also used identity first language, and 88% they referred to themselves or their loved one as autistic or an autistic person. So why this shift, and why is this such a big deal? In the early stages of this work, many of us were definitely told not to use this kind of language. It was almost considered almost a profanity to use the word autistic when I was coming up in the field, and this is of course many years ago. So this has been a pretty big shift. Why is this so important now? And what does this really represent? Well, there's a really great website, the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, and on that website, you can find this blog about this very topic. It's good. I would recommend it to you. And here's the screenshot of that website. But the author of this blog says that using the term person with autism, it suggests that the person can be separated from autism, which simply isn't true. Another respondent said, my autism is not an accessory that I can set aside. It's not something external that is latched onto me. It is not an illness or disease I have caught. It is a fundamental, inseparable part of me and who I am. So in support of my values of supporting neurodiverse and autistic people, I'm going to use identity first language today. If that doesn't align with your preferences, I hope you'll forgive me and sort of accept this in the spirit which I intended. But for me, this idea of autism being a fundamental, inseparable part of who someone is, this really gets at the heart of a topic that's very important in the field today, and that is the idea of neurodiversity. So neurodiversity, if you're not familiar with the term, or if a new term to you, or you've heard it but you're not quite sure what it means, it's simply a belief, a recognition, and embracing of the full spectrum of neurological functioning. It's a belief that variation in neurological development and neurological functioning, that's just a natural part and a valuable part of being human. And because of that, differences do not necessarily equal disability. So a neurodiversity does not equal disability. And I'm going to go into that a little bit more in a sec. There are two models, two prevailing attitudes really related to disability when it comes to autism and other neurodiversities. The first one is a medical model, and this is one that probably most people are familiar with. And the idea goes something like this. A diagnosis of a disability reflects evidence of a deficit or impairment that requires treatment, and it should be cured. So this is, we're probably all very familiar with this model. This aligns with things like, anytime you would go to a physician to seek medical treatment. So let's say you have unfortunately you're diagnosed with cancer, right? You have an implicit and internal disability that has to be cured and has to be treated. The second model is a little harder to identify, and it's this idea of a social model of disability. And that model says that at least some of the difficulties faced by individuals with disabilities are due to societal barriers. So things that we have created, stigmas, ableist systems, lack of accommodations, rather than the impairments or differences that are characteristic of their diagnosis. So on one hand, we have this idea that it is inherent, implicit in the individual. On the other hand, we have this idea that the disability may be more a result of just the systems that society has created, the barriers that they're making it difficult or creating challenges in that person's life. So almost an artificial disability, if you will. Let's look at an example of how these might show up, even in some of our research and some of our thinking. So I'm going to share a study with you. I'm going to give you the cliff notes. Don't worry, it's not boring. It won't get too detailed, but this is a study from the journal Autism in 2020. So this is a fairly recent publication. And the study, the researchers were interested to see how well different neurotypes could pass information along using a short story. The story was fairly complicated. It contained about 30 key elements or bits of information. And in the study, the researchers would have a script, and they would come into a room with a participant 1, and the researcher would read the story to participant 1, and then they would leave the room. And then a new participant 2, would come into the room. And the job was participant 1 has to remember and relay as much of the story as they can to participant 2. And then they leave the room and a new individual comes in and so on. And they do this for many people. And the whole thing is recorded. And the idea is they're looking to see how well does that information get communicated from one person to the other. So they replicated this whole experiment 3 times. And what's interesting here is that they did this with different groups of people. So in one experiment, the participants were all autistic. So this was called the autistic chain. And in another experiment, all of the participants did not have autism. And then a mixed chain, a third chain, had an alternating autistic, non-autistic person. So in this group, an autistic person would be either receiving or communicating to a non-autistic person. What was really great about this study is that the results were that the autistic chain and the non-autistic chain communicated equally effectively. They were very, very good, or about the same, at communicating all of those 30 elements to everybody in the chain. What was definitely different was the mixed chain. The mixed chain was significantly less skilled at communicating those elements. And so what happens is, I think that the study, and again, this is one study, so we do need to be careful that we're not drawing too many conclusions from one study, but the findings in this study would suggest that communication difficulties arise from a mismatch in their neurotype, not necessarily an inherent characteristics of autism. So this is very consistent with a social model of disability. So is it that autistic people have fundamental impairments in communication all the time? Or is it that we have created a model of what communication must look like, and an autistic person does not conform to the model that we as a society have created? So I think you'll see, the main point here is that the communication wasn't impaired for the autistic group, but it was perceived to be impaired when it was compared to how non-autistic people communicate. So a person can have autism, and they can have all of the characteristics that go along with that. Likewise, a person can have functional limitations and not have autism. So what's important to understand is that where these two overlap, we see autism-related disabilities. And as we know, there can be great variability in the way those disabilities will impact a person. They can be very mild, or they can have a very profound impact on the way someone functions, and especially across different domains. And we need interventions that sort of focus on these autism-related disabilities in this area. But it's important to distinguish the difference between simply having autism and having a functional limitation related to that autism. So in other words, you can have autism without functional limitations in many or some domains. And you can have functional limitations without having autism. So they are not necessarily equivalent. It's time that we learn to separate autism symptom reduction from autism-related disabilities and really just focus primarily on those limitations that impact the quality of life. So when you hold a belief or apply sort of that medical model to autism and focus on sort of fixing characteristics of autism, you create a false belief that simply having autism means that a person is disabled and that all of their characteristics of autism are equally disabling. And this is what's known as ableism. Ableism is defined as beliefs and practices that devalue and discriminate against people with physical, intellectual, or psychiatric disabilities. And this often rests on the assumption that disabled people need to be fixed in one form or another. So, as you can imagine, self-advocates, individuals, family members, autistic people are asking that non-autistic people stop thinking of their autism as something that automatically always needs to be fixed or removed, but rather to be supported and accepted as part of the individual. For many years, the puzzle piece was a symbol for understanding and treating autism. And in fact, when I was coming up in the field, that was kind of a symbol of hope and, meant to sort of exemplify the work that we were doing. And it's very consistent with sort of that medical way of thinking that, like, okay, we have to solve this problem, we have to fix this issue. Many self-advocates now are reporting that they find this symbol to be offensive because, again, they don't see their autism as something that needs to be fixed. There are certain autism symptoms that are certainly useful in treating and identifying autism and, in fact, diagnosing autism, but that may not be appropriate to target for intervention or to treat. And I'll give you another non-autism related example, which I often think about when I'm considering what to kind of target or to intervene on. So my mother is left-handed. And about the time I myself was a young child learning to form my letters and, and working on my handwriting, my mother told me a story of how when she was young, learning to form her letters, she was made to write only with her right hand. And I asked her, as a young person, I asked her, well, were you not able to write with your left hand? And she said, oh no, my penmanship was perfect with my left hand. And I couldn't understand this. Well, why were you not allowed to write with your left hand? And her answer was simply, well, it wasn't done. It's just not how it was expected to be. And so I often think of this example, and I wonder if maybe some of the things that we automatically, without thinking, treat or target for intervention for individuals with autism could fall into this category. So one really common example that you see a lot is this idea of requiring eye contact. So it makes us question sometimes, what is the point of eye contact? Is it to improve communication? Is it a social interaction? What is it? And is it maybe something that we have said, well, this is just the way that we do things, and this is a requirement? Another area where I think the field is beginning to re-examine whether this is simply a characteristic of autism versus a functional limitation is this idea of targeting for intervention harmless stereotypy. So individuals with autism will often engage in repetitive movements, and many times these movements are fairly harmless. Now, they may look different from other neurotypes, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are a limitation for the individual. Forcing interactions or proximity with other people. Many autistics will report that being in large crowds or forced to interact with people is very stressful. requiring long periods of sitting or staying in one place. And this is true for many neurotypes, that sort of this idea of like sitting for 6, 7, 8 hours in a school day is artificial and very difficult. That may not be something that necessarily requires our intervention. And finally, eliminating echolalia or scripted phrases, or even talking about their preferred topics. Restricting that kind of activity because it doesn't look normal might be an example of ableist practices. So what would the opposite look like? What would a neurodiverse stance look like? We all most of us will engage in some form of self-soothing behaviors, and we have kind of, as a group, as a society, we have decided which of those self-soothing behaviors are socially appropriate and which ones are not. This is just an artificial construct. This is just something that we, as a group of people, have decided. Like, it's okay if you if you bite your fingernails. It's okay if you twirl your hair. It's okay if you rock your feet a little bit, in a meeting or at school, but it's probably not okay if you wave your hands in front of your face or make vocalizations, right? So we've created kind of some of maybe these artificial constructs. Stimming is an important way that autistic people relieve stress and find joy. In fact, there are many behaviors that some of us engage in. I can think of things like running, if you're a runner. Maybe you pace back and forth when you're on a stressful call, or maybe you sing in the shower to relax yourself, or you crochet. That's a very repetitive motion and movement, but many people find these things relaxing. So to eliminate sort of the similar activities from an autistic person's day could be very stressful. Another way we can adopt a neurodiverse stance is through how we think about friendships and how we help and support people have friendships if they have autism. So many autistics will report that autistic friends are extremely valuable. And forcing, I think, autistic people to only interact or primarily interact with non-autistic people could have some pretty important implications for that person. And there's evidence to suggest that autistic adults report feeling less comfortable with non-autistic friends. They find those autistic friends to be very valuable because it really allows them to be themselves. Similarly, the way that autistic friendships look is different than the way that non-autistic friendships look. And so by forcing autistic people to engage in friendships that look just like a different neurotype, we could, in fact, be coming at this from kind of more of an ableist stance. Eye contact is not necessary for effective communication, and the study that we shared earlier exemplifies that. You don't need to have a good eye contact in order to share information. And actually, it can be very aversive for autistic people, and they report feeling that actually forcing them to cover up their natural tendencies can actually create a feeling of isolation and loneliness, which is ironic because as non-autistic people hoping to facilitate good communication in the people that we support, and by requiring eye contact, we think that we're indeed improving communication and connection. But in fact, autistic people are telling us that those practices are actually leading to an increase in isolation and loneliness. So I think to sum up, the idea here is that we as providers have to stop ourselves and ask some questions. What does the person that we support, the people that we support, what do they need others to do differently? What do they need us to do differently? Instead of asking, what do we need the person to do differently? So we should be looking at this from a supportive perspective rather than forcing change. So another way that the field is beginning to change is around this idea of selecting treatment goals and objectives as we embark on supporting people with autism. In 1987, there was a seminal paper published, and it was the first of its kind that showed ABA was very, very effective at creating some very positive outcomes for individuals with autism. This is a paper probably many of you are familiar with, and this is where we get that sort of 40 hours a week recommendation for ABA, and that's simply because that was the number of treatment hours that were used in this article. we can credit this article to a lot of good things happening within autism services, and probably led to insurance reform and increased funding, et cetera. But one of the artifacts of this article was the way that success was defined. And in the article, Dr. Ivar Lovaas defines successful outcomes as normal intelligence and educational functioning with a normal range IQ and successful first grade performance in public school. So in this article that sort of set the tone for what treatment looks like, how much treatment you need, what success looks like, we have laid this foundation that sort of sets this expectation that you need to look normal. In order for it to be successful, you have to have normal IQ, normal functioning, normal first grade activity. And I think looking indistinguishable was kind of the objective. And I will tell you, growing up in the field, again, that was the goal for many of us. And so all of the things here today that I'm going to say are shifts that we need to make are also mistakes that I have made as a professional. But that idea of sort of looking indistinguishable as the ideal for success has definitely changed. And now what we are beginning to do is look at success differently, and we're looking at long-term outcomes, and specifically, how can we improve quality of life for individuals with autism? There's been a lot of great research recently in this field, and a lot of practices that are beginning to focus on quality of life as a primary outcome. And for good reason. According to the National Autism Indicators Report in 2015, overall individuals with autism spectrum disorder have poor outcomes in adulthood when compared to same-age peers in just about every area that is typically evaluated. Things like the number of folks attending post-secondary education, their employment status, living arrangements, social and community participation, access to services, physical and mental health, and safety. So there's a lot of reasons why we should be attending to quality of life. What is quality of life? According to the World Health Organization, it's defined as an individual's perception of their position in life in the context of the culture and value systems in which they live, and in relation to their goals, expectations, standards, and concerns. I really love this definition because inherent in the definition is this idea that what's important to the individual is the thing to be concerned about. What's important to them in terms of relation to their goals, their expectations, their standards, and not maybe a set of standards that's been applied universally. It's hard to think about quality of life until you really start thinking about some of the domains. And so this is a table pulled from an article in the Practice for Persons with Severe Disabilities in 2021. And the article essentially made a very strong argument that quality of life for people with disabilities needs to be the primary dependent variable, or the primary outcome. And so some of the domains that were listed here include things like self-determination, emotional well-being, interpersonal relationships, material well-being, personal development, physical well-being, and rights and inclusion. And then here you can see some, I know there's a lot of words here, but you can see some more definitions. I think this is a really important slide. And in fact, if there was like one slide that you walked away with today, or that you took a picture of, or that you screenshot, I think it's this one. And I think if you could take these definitions here, and as a parent, as a provider, as an agency owner, that you took these examples here and you worked hard to incorporate these things into the services that you provide, that your impact will be greatly increased. And we see that happening. Contemporary autism support is refocusing on these areas and focusing less on symptom reduction. It's possible to both have symptoms of autism and have a high quality of life. So we're focusing on building skills that ensure well-being and advocating for inclusion. And you see things on here that everyone would indeed choose for themselves. So what are some things that service providers should do to be addressing quality of life? Well, when it comes to emotional well-being, things like creating physical spaces that allow individuals to stay relaxed, calm, and engaged. Teaching skills that support making choices, requesting, refusing, sharing your preferences. This falls in line with that domain of self-determination, being able to make choices about things in your life. Supporting friendships or interpersonal relationships, both in and outside the family. Working towards long-term outcomes early. I think this is one area where, in particular, the folks that support autistic children should be really attending to and thinking about probably a sooner transition to thinking about how will this individual be functioning as they approach, adolescence, young adulthood. We need to be doing a better job at looking at those long-term goals much sooner. For me, I feel like viewing leisure skills is a crucial component of healthy functioning. And I'm going to talk about that more in a bit. Building an inclusive community. So this has a little bit to do with some advocacy work as well. Paying attention to healthy routines, exercise, getting outside, and then making sure that we're supporting healthy sleeping and eating patterns as well. One of the ways where the field has really evolved and evolved rapidly is around the area of Ascent and the use of Ascent-based practices. And if you're not familiar with the term Ascent, essentially is this idea that clients, actually everyone, young and old, have the right to make decisions about their treatment, including if and how they want to participate in that treatment. The idea here is that we are providing a lot of self-determination, a lot of choice, giving clients predictable routines that help them feel safe, and teaching them skills that support making choices, requesting, refusing, and hopefully sharing their preferences with us so that we as support providers can incorporate that. For Ascent, what you're looking for is the approval or agreement to treatment. And we would consider this to be a necessity, a must-have, ethically necessary. We have to protect that client dignity and choice. Often children will assent by freely just participating in the session or in the service. And in order for it truly to be considered assent, they also have to have the freedom to withdraw their assent or, to dissent. An important component of Ascent and Ascent-based practices is an awareness for service providers that there has likely been some trauma in this individual's past. And we know this because there's research to support that autistic people are at a increased risk for trauma. And this can include, of course, very acute traumatic experiences, but it can also include low grade but repeated traumatic experiences. So even something like being in a crowded location, being forced to be in a crowded location repeatedly over time, that can have sort of a traumatic effect on an individual. So as service providers, we have to kind of consider that as we move through services in order to kind of keep that in mind and hopefully to provide some compassion there. In practice, what are some things that the parents can help ensure providers are doing and that providers could take into their own work? Number one, hands down, the most important thing that you should be doing is teaching learners how to say no, how to refuse, and then most importantly, honoring that, right? Making sure that we're making space to allow the client to say no. Sometimes we have learners who are non-speaking or do not have a way to communicate with us. They're learning how to do so. So we as service providers need to make sure that we understand what does it look like when a child is happy, when they're engaged, when they are seemingly assenting to practice. And parents are really good at this. They can usually define this very well for service providers. My belief is this should be documented. This should be part of a service plan describing what it looks like when an individual is assenting to treatment. One other practical way that providers or parents can ensure that assent is taking place is to just have open doors. So in our clinics, for example, doors are kept open. Sometimes clients actually prefer to shut the door, but they always have the option to leave if they choose. Now, I will say there are also some non-negotiables. So, for example, you can leave a clinic room, but you can't leave at the front door, right? So there are some precautions in place, but for the most part, having this idea to kind of vote with your feet, to come and go, tells the provider where that client wants to be and how much they want to participate. Also, as providers, it's up to us to modify or discontinue certain procedures. The use of physical prompting can be pretty uncomfortable for pretty much most anybody. So we really have to think closely or take a real good look at the use of those physical prompting procedures and making sure that we're never ever putting a client in a position where they feel like they have to go along with our treatment expectations. We're kind of backing away from other procedures like extinction and certainly not really relying on any kind of compliance training. The emphasis is definitely more on going slow and building trust and making sure that we're keeping those relationships strong. There are going to be things that are not negotiable, right? Like if you are a young individual or an individual who's not self-toilet and maybe requires diapering, changing a diaper is a non-negotiable, right? That is something that must occur. Now, how it happens, the frequency at which it happens, where it happens, those are negotiable. So the idea is that we are kind of looking for places where we can have the individual make decisions about their life instead of all the decisions being made for them. Some other Ascent-based practices is really just this idea of peaceful progress. I will go back again and use examples from the early days of my training. And I remember watching and being instructed to use procedures like, we would seat the child in a room or in a location with put them kind of maybe up against a wall or in a corner with a table between the client and the door so that the client was not able to leave. And in some cases, it was just like, even if there was if the child became very upset or there was a tantrum, the idea was like, you would just like work through it. It was, kind of for their own good. And as horrible as to say these things out loud, that this is how the field looked 20 years ago, 25 years ago. That is absolutely not the case anymore. Peaceful progress is the name of the game. We don't need to use those procedures. There's very good research to support that those are not needed, and then they in fact can cause harm. So just overall, a compassionate approach when things are difficult for the learner and also for families. The goal is to just keep those really strong relationships. We want to have trust. We want to make sure that the clients feel safe with us. Asking, what can I do to make this session more appealing, more engaging? Asking, would I choose this for myself? Would I want to be like forced to stay in a room with someone I wasn't really comfortable with? Probably not. Asking your providers, as parents or caregivers, what Ascent-based practices are you using with my child? Like, what do you have baked into the treatment plan that assures me that my child has some self-determination in the way that their treatment is carried out? Okay. Another area where I think, again, these are my interpretations. These are my observations looking, back at a life of 25 years providing the services. I feel, and others as well feel, that we need to be paying more attention to leisure skills and just leisure and participation, recreation. And actually, leisure and recreation participation is often used as an indicator of success when measuring quality of life. So I think providers and parents should view leisure skill activities as crucial components of healthy functioning and not just sort of a nice to have. Or waiting for like sort of the perfect storm, waiting for everything to line up nicely in order to begin working on those skills. I feel like developing healthy routines and participating in outdoor activities or sports is really important to a healthy body, a healthy sleep, and so forth. So why leisure skills? Why is this important? Well, community participation is associated with a range of positive developmental outcomes. And this is true across the board for autistic people and non-autistic people or other neurodiversities. The more community participation you have, the better your quality of life. And we saw that. We saw that on that list that I asked you to take a screenshot of those skills that are really important for quality of life. And one of those was personal development. So having hobbies, having interests, these are things that are going to really strengthen that person's quality of life. Autistic children and adolescents participate in fewer activities compared to non-autistic peers, and that is what the research is telling us. Many of the barriers include the social demands of the activities. And again, I would propose here, are the demands of the activities themselves too difficult, or are the expectations that we have put around participation been artificially created, and maybe are they not inclusive of autistic people and their specific neurodiversities? Social communication skills and participation in school and home activities were the biggest influencers as to whether parents reported that the child was thriving. So when asked, how is your child doing? Are they thriving? The individuals that had more of that school and home activity participation were reported to have been doing better. And there's numerous reported strategies and the results in the literature, again, for how you can do this, for how you can incorporate leisure activities into treatment. And many of them are even activity specific. And I listed here a reference. This is a book chapter that you can find that lists out different areas of interest. I mean, everything from dance to beekeeping to online gaming was on this list, and there were research articles tied to each of them on how that could potentially take place. So there are resources out there on how we can do this. Another area where we see the field really beginning to advance is around this idea of compassion. And we're going to talk about this quite a bit more in the next talk, but for today, specifically the area where autism service providers have really begun to ask some tough questions is around the idea of compassionate treatment for caregivers and guardians. There was an article published recently, 2018, fairly recently, and I would say this article, at least in the field of behavior analysis, applied behavior analysis, has really sparked some tough conversation about how well behavior analysts interact with the caregivers that they support. The primary purpose of the article was to provide information about that relationship between caregivers and parents, and hopefully then to inform behavior analysts on how they're doing. The article had 95 participants, so not a huge sample. So again, we have to be careful that when we review surveys or studies like this, that we're not overgeneralizing too much. This is just a snapshot. But ultimately, the results were not great for behavior analysts. There was evidence to suggest that many of the parents were reported that they weren't feeling a lot of compassion and a lot of empathy from their behavior analyst. So, for example, the parents were asked to agree or disagree with statements. So one statement was, the behavior analyst regularly asks me if I'm happy with how things are going. Pretty basic question, right? Like, how do you feel like things are going? Only 61% of the 95 parents that responded said yes to that. I think, there's room for improvement there for sure. The behavior analyst compromises with me when we do not agree. Only 59% said yes to that. The behavior analyst respects my cultural values and beliefs. 67% said yes. And finally, the behavior analyst regularly modifies procedures and skills, target skills, based on my concerns. 68% said yes. So definitely a lot of room for improvement. Now, while this article does not claim to be all-encompassing of the field, what it has done is it's become sort of the spark that has really ignited a great movement within behavior analysis to try to push towards different models and making sure that providers now receive a lot of training on things like compassionate care and family-centered care, which we're going to talk about next. Family-centered care, I believe, is the way that autism services are moving, especially for children with autism or families that are working to support their adult children. And fundamentally, the idea here is that individuals are just better supported when their family is also supported. Family-centered care is a recognized model. It actually comes from the pediatric nursing literature, and there are 8 tenets of family-centered care. The first one here is that the understanding the caregiver needs to approach the work they do with the understanding that the family is the constant. Service providers are going to come and go, and I'm sure many of you have experienced this. You have a habilitator or you have a therapist for a while, and then after a year or maybe less, they move on, and then we're sort of forced to kind of start over again. We recognize with a family-centered care model that you have to collaborate with families. That's crucial. So we need to get 100% of families that are saying, my provider is willing to change course when I provide input. Professionals need to be exchanging unbiased and complete information and honoring the diversity of families. Agencies should be actively educating their families on the importance of those cultural influences. So embedded in this family-centered model is this idea that we have to be attending to diversity, we have to be attending to culture. Another important idea here is that professionals are understanding that families are going to cope in different ways. They're going to maybe accept strategies or not accept strategies with different results. They're going to have different reactions to the things that we're requesting. They're going to have different reactions to the news that we share with them. And this is all normal. This is all just part of the typical variation. There is no one way that a family must be when they're interacting with us. We really strongly encourage family-to-family networking. This is an important tenet of a family-centered care model. And at the organizational level, there must be systems in place that are flexible, that allow a family to access comprehensive services in a way that meet that family's complex and diverse needs. So we can't have organizations and systems that are so rigid that they're inflexible and then unable to meet a family's needs if those needs happen to be different than the norm. And finally, the family-centered care model really rests on this assumption that providers see autistic children as children first, and they see families raising autistic children as families first. And when you do that, you kind of walk into this with an awareness that in all families, every family, neurodiverse or not, they're going to have their own unique challenges. They're going through stuff, right? And autism may be a big part of that, but it's not the whole part. So walking into that with an awareness really goes a long way towards providing that compassion. So really, it's just, taking a step back as providers, evaluating when things get difficult. Agencies looking to help facilitate this, and organizations need procedures to sort of support this, both at the staff training level and even in their procedures and policies. So to kind of just wrap us up here, the way that we talk and think about autism and neurodiversity is changing. We're shifting from a symptom reduction model to a more inclusive, neuro-affirming approach to treatment. Providers need to be prioritizing reducing functional limitations and teaching skills in settings that are likely to improve quality of life, like in community settings, like leisure skills. We need to be supporting and listening to autistic people and their families, and that's critical to meaningful long-term outcomes. And finally, we must include Ascent-based practices and compassion for the people that we hope to support. We must continue to listen, to learn, and when we know better, we must do better and take that work into our practice. Okay, that is all for me. I don't think there are no questions, so I'll put my contact information up here on the screen if anyone would like to email me if you have questions, or this has maybe sparked some thoughts, or you want to continue the discussion. Part of my work is a commitment to advocating for these practices. I really feel like this is the way the field needs to be working. So because of that, I am deeply committed to helping anybody either adopt these practices or learn more about them. So please reach out to me at my email, carey@azunited.org, and I'd be happy to continue the discussion, happy to answer your questions. Also happy to share the slide deck and any resources that you saw today. All right, everybody, thank you so much for listening to me today and giving up a good portion of your Saturday. I really appreciate you, and I really appreciate your time. Thank you.